Okay, Samreen, you were one of the contributors to this report on middle management. And I know the angle you were taking was the move from top-down management through to the middle manager be much more of a sense maker. Do you want to explain a bit about the angle that you took?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. It's really nice to have this conversation and to bring voice to some of the concepts that we all brought together in that paper. So, look, we're living in really fascinating times, and managers, we all manage in our own ways, don't we? Um, we have various requirements in our day-to-day life at work. And those requirements are a combination of who we are and what we technically bring with what the demands of the current context present. And I would suggest that the current context, the backdrop that managers are working in today, is a different backdrop. It's changed, it's unfolding, it's not static, but I would say that it's significantly different to what it may have been, even I was going to say 10 to 15 years ago, but I would say even 3 to 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think there was like a watershed of COVID, which made a lot of difference with people's views about work and where it fitted into their lives, I guess. But what would you say
Absolutely.
were the key changes in the last 10 years?
So I'd say the pace of life has changed. I think we are operating at an exponentially faster pace. We're thinking faster, we're deciding faster, we're reacting faster. And we've talked about technology as being an enabler and an accelerator for decades now. But the level of acceleration, I would say, in the last 3 to 5 years, even within the last 18 months to 2 years, has been unprecedented with AI. So that's one thing. I think pace has changed. I would say that if you look at the post industrial model of management and leadership and just the way in which organizations have been set up and run, there was a very reductionist, and actually in many ways that's a very helpful reductionist approach to breaking things down into pieces so that we could better understand, we could better control, yeah, perhaps to one end of the spectrum, better manage or influence at the other end of the spectrum. And my sense is that whole notion has been unpacked and continues to be unpacked. We've gone from working in environments that were more siloed, more linear, more predictable, and we're working far more in fluid, much more meshed environments, ecosystems. So for me, I think that's the second really big fundamental change. And so taking a systemic understanding of that requires a level of skill and awareness that perhaps we didn't need in the early 1900s, and even in the subsequent 50, 60 years. So I would say that those two conditions are really significant, and the pace and the complexity and the interdependent nature that's not linear and not predictable that has caused this to change. But I think there's a third factor I would say, which is you mentioned the pandemic, you mentioned a or social health and economic impacting factor. And I think the socio-political backdrop today is, once again, unprecedented. Now, it may have been actually, if we look back to some of the wars and the, colonial periods and some of these extremely, you know, um, exaggerate, when we look at history, the exaggerated forms of how humanity has behaved, I would suggest that perhaps it's not unprecedented. We are going through another version of something that may have happened in the past. But the difference is we have access to it. We see it. We viscerally interact with it. And the immediate effects are felt at a level that I would say did not exist 100 years ago or before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to get into politics on this discussion, but I do know you have a Venezuelan background, and you must be very interested in, therefore, from that particular angle, what's happening in world politics and so on. But so back to leadership in a way, we seem to be moving more into an authoritarian type of leadership, which of course is the one we thought we were moving out of in terms of that was industrial age, top down, hierarchical, and we're moving more to networked influences. Do you think that we've got a younger generation of managers coming through get it, and there's an older generation who are out of date, and we kind of have to wait for a generational change?
A really excellent question, and I think we are all pondering some of the like immediate experiences of those changes in generations and or differences in generations rather. And I would say that from my personal experience and from working with clients across those generations, that these differences are fairly stark in many cases. And I would also suggest, middle managers are the shock absorbers of the systems within which they work. They are constantly taking in some of the more cognitive, logic-based, some of the more tangible aspects of how a business grows profitably and maintains or protects its livelihood in that context that we've just been talking about. And I would say that these middle managers are also absorbing the emotional fallout of that. They are, we all are in our own way, everyone in an organization. It's not just middle management, but middle managers are actually at that buffer because they're often holding the demands that at a very, very tangible level and an operational level that are being driven by what is being decided at a board level, at an executive level, at a senior leadership level. And they're having to somehow absorb that. And then they're having to lead the rest of the troops at a very, very tactical level. So that absorption is often affecting their nervous systems. And if we just reflect a little bit on the last 5 years, we've now got a language that we can use to talk about it, more neuroscientific. We have got an awareness that actually this stuff is not just affecting some people rather than others, and it is fundamentally profound. It is, and it's cumulative. So this shock absorption that's happening within this system is happening at a human level, at a scientific level, and at a spiritual level within organizations.
That's fantastic. I love the image of the middle manager being the shock absorber. That's great. But do you think the current generation of middle managers have the innate skills, competences, ability to transfer from being essentially a transmitter of instructions through to a herder of cats, almost, in the sense of dealing with making some sense out of chaos, managing, caring for the people in their group?
Yeah, look, I think I'm going to answer it sort of back to front for a minute, and then maybe we can explore that together. I don't really know the answer to that. I do have perspectives around what I see and what I witness, and I've got sort of teenage children, and then I can see some of the generational differences between them and what's happening at, like, for 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and those sorts of, and I don't want to over label the different YZs, all these, but I'm definitely witnessing some very interesting dynamics in the making. But there are three. Let me just answer it the other way. So I would say that there are three things that would enable managers to play that shock absorption role. Or to have, I mean, I don't even think that they've got a choice in that, but to actually really make sense and interpret what's happening in a system, and then to manage effectively, to manage and thrive whilst doing this, and to have the imprint or the contribution that's required by the organization, as well as what I would suggest they would want to be making, their desired contribution. I think one of them is being able to self-regulate. So if demands are significant and they come, let's just use the hierarchical, simplistic version for a minute, but top down. There is often, in my experience, this, because there's no organization with infinite capacity, so you've got these finite capacities. So, and some of these demands can be perhaps unrealistic or overly ambitious. So there is a stress response that comes with that, right? Often it can be experienced as threat, and this is when it's consistently demanding, which I would say constitutes a lot of the leaders that I work with and the managers. That ability to then pause, and I often say the pause is the one thing that we have available to us as managers and leaders that's not colonized by speed. So the ability to pause and to just take stock for a minute. What's going on with me? What's going on with my team? Or what's going on with the stakeholders that are placing these demands? What's going on? Let's zoom out for a minute, and what's going on in the bigger picture? How small am I, a grain of sand, relative to this whole thing? And then what's within my gift of influence to actually do something about this? That regulation, and I actually probably outline the more conscious version of it, is absolutely critical. And my sense is that, and again, I get many people who come into my coaching space, because I'm an executive coach, who run in, usually even though we contract and I say, please don't come in back-to-back meetings, please make sure you've got 15 minutes at least, if not 30 minutes, maybe go for a walk before our coaching session and after. But that never happens. Well, it doesn't not ever happen. It actually gets better as our coaching contract unfolds. But often I see them rushing in, and the first pause that they have that day or that week or that month is in the invitation that I give them to do that. So that regulation is absolutely critical. And I think for me, the question they're asking themselves is, can I stay grounded under pressure? Can I remain in the stillness, actually in the discomfort of what's happening here? And can I stay grounded? The second thing I would say is relational attunement. And this is, the question that they're asking themselves is, can I really read and respond to what is happening in this system and with the people around me? Whether it's my team, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a politically perceived stakeholder, whoever it might be. Yeah, it could even be their family, right? So how do I relationally attune? Yeah, now let's put those two together, regulation and attunement. So when we're regulating ourselves, there's nothing more powerful, in my experience, than being totally discombobulated, but then suddenly entering the presence of somebody who's grounded and regulated. They don't have to say a word, and I can see my energetic field change. And when we're attuning relationally, when we're making these conscious and choiceful interactions actually purposeful, we've got an opportunity to understand how we're going to respond rather than to react. And again, when you're absorbing shocks and high demands, those two skills and those two resources can really help you to make sense and to, with agency, resource, and skill, address whatever comes. And then there was a final one, right? So I said self-regulation, relational attunement, and then the third one, and I talk about this in the article, is systemic awareness. And I've mentioned the word systemic already. The question I think I would be encouraging them to be able to ask is, can I see the wider pattern here beyond my lane? And in my experience, and this I sort of touched on it, that grain of sand, a manager who can zoom out, see the smallness of what they are in relation to the bigger picture, in a regulated state, in a way that helps them to truly understand that relational dynamic and then attune to that, those three things would enable them to work through that shock absorption with resource and skill.
Yeah, it's fantastic. The ability to stand back, or just being afforded the time to do that. And I guess part of that rat race, if you like, of always rushing to catch up is, well, some of it clearly self-imposed because people could force themselves to take the time. Some of it is organizationally enforced because there's expectations that middle managers, for example, are going from one meeting to the next and having time to stop and breathe. But so do you think it's possible through changing the organizational processes, the infrastructure, the meetings, the schedules, the things that force middle managers to do what they have to do? Is there a kind of an organization of the future that allows people the time to stop and breathe, that encourages middle managers to step back and look at the bigger picture? Or will they always be inevitably driven by the need to achieve organizational goals or day-to-day stuff? Do you think it's feasible to create an environment where that will work?
The short answer is yes, but there is a requirement, and organizations, they optimize for performance metrics. It's absolutely, you mentioned goals, and striving, and come on, we work and live in a society where the implicit assumption is only one person must win at the top, or only one entity must win at the top, right? So there is a fundamental paradigm here that we're all sort of operating within. What actually determines success in a complex world, in the research that I've been doing over the last few years, is not an ability to perform, it's coherence. It's an ability to cohere with everything that's moving and changing. And that coherence is the understanding, the achievement of teams being aligned, decisions interconnecting with one another, meaning flowing. And for that to be the case, some of the measurement, and we talk about reward, one of our partners is very passionate about this, reward systems, are rooted in this. I'll tell me how you're going to measure me, I'll tell you how I'm going to behave or how I'm going to deliver, right? So they're rooted in that fundamental basic principle. So if we are to help create a fabric that enables alignment, connection, flow between moving entities in an unfolding complex environment, we've got to question everything from those basic measures to the team structure, to the quality of the conversations that we're encouraging, to the quality of the conversations that we're not encouraging, to the kind of spaces where we meet. Rather than meet around a big boardroom table, can we meet without the table? Get rid of the actual shield, or I call it the barrier that gets in the middle of all of us. Can we make it far more reflective of humanity?
Yeah. And I guess if somebody has the benefit of your coaching, for example, that gives them an opportunity to step back again. And I suppose if the mode of leadership becomes one much less of direction and much more of coaching and encouraging, and the middle manager becomes somebody who is delegating and trusting people and working with his or her team, that's kind of quite a different environment from the traditional top-down hierarchical organization. The problem, as you pointed out, is of course there inevitably are financial goals and stakeholders who are looking for a level of performance
Mm.
out of people in organizations. But I guess your argument and mine would be, but to get the best out of people, you've got to take the bigger picture. Do you think organizations are ready to accept the fact that people have other lives other than their job, and to take that much more into account when designing work in future, allowing for the fact we already have flexible working and stuff on the fringe, but really allowing jobs and tasks that people do to be adaptable, flexible enough so they really do suit the individual. And almost, it's a bit like you mentioned rewards, skill-based pay. You pay somebody for their abilities as opposed to giving them a job description, say follow that, we pay you for that. It's a kind of almost approaching work from the other end, designing work around people rather than designing work into jobs and then fitting the people to the jobs. Is that a bit idealistic, or do you see it as a possible future?
Yeah, look, I think we've explored some of these concepts and desired futures. But my sense is that actually, um, there's probably three things that I wanted to sort of mention, and my mind is going there. So I'm going to start there really quickly and then come back to it. Are these futures possible? So when we talk about command and control, top down language or paradigm, my sense is that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I do think that there are times and there are environments, high risk environments, and there are situations where being prescriptive, being informative, actually challenging someone's notion of what's perhaps appropriate or inappropriate is absolutely necessary. And we probably spent a few decades unpicking at that and challenging the need for that top down, and I call it prescriptive approach. But take certain industries. You would not want your neurosurgeon to not be prescriptive with their team when they're in the middle of an operation on your brain, right? So we do know that there are situations, just like in oil and gas industry, you definitely want people to be telling you exactly what to do, to avoid a leak. So I think for me, it's not throwing the baby out with bathwater. It's being mindful and purposeful and meaningful around when those sorts of approaches need to skillfully be used. But on the other hand, I do think we had to unpick some of it because there was so much command and control based, maybe military rooted for good reason. Again, look at the military environment and look at all the world we're living in right now, right? So the other side of it was we can't keep using that kind of approach because it totally undermines the human spirit, and it totally undermines the possibility for us to actually Socratically build on what we already know, it can sprout through a more catalytic, supportive, and encouraging type of approach. So I think both sides, and in fact in the paper I talk about the contradictions that sit across those two, what needs to be pushed and told versus what needs to be pulled and encouraged. And those are absolutely necessary. As middle managers, those skills now more than ever need to be ambidextrous around all of that. Okay. The second thing I think I want to say is businesses will always have shareholder expectations, and I mean unless we have a fundamental shift from capitalism to socialism, and even then, by the way, I don't think there's any one model that is going to create, and I'm sure that through the onset of AI, that our political systems are going to fundamentally change. I've been really interested about how some of the discourse around all that. But regardless, there's always going to be a set of expectations. There's going to be I would say, a dance between ambition and realism. And for me, what's really important here is, again, a little bit like what I've just said, is how do we address both. How do we remain able to rise to the demands, because the environment and the social, political, economic context is going to require us to. And that's great because it keeps us nimble, it keeps us learning, it keeps us unfolding and evolving. You know, that's what we do as humans. We, like every other animal in the animal kingdom, we evolve. So we do want some of that strive. But on the other hand, how do we also allow ourselves to contemplate, to, you know, actually prioritize spending some time doing nothing, just being? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those two, I hope, are really important context for what, you know, I might say around the question that you ask about those possible futures, because I think it isn't a seesaw. It might feel like a seesaw at times, yeah. But I think for me, it's how do we, again, understand the bigger picture, understand some of the interdependent aspects here that enable us to understand when demands, when ambition, when drive is necessary, and how to attune to that in a self-regulated form, and when is it actually more important to say, I'm not going to do this right now. In fact, I'm going to put a boundary down. I'm going to take a risk and challenge my stakeholder or the board or whoever it might be, because it might be a chief exec having to negotiate that themselves. So that for me, and I think when it comes to like where we work, how we work, whether it's a skill-based reward system or measurement system, it needs to be a dynamic equilibrium. It needs to be something that shifts depending on the context. I mean, it probably feels a little bit too chaotic and too difficult to achieve that. But the reality is that we are complex systems and we are complex beings within those systems.
I
There's
think that's
no one answer.
there's a great note to finish on because our time's almost up. We that the world is becoming more complex, and as you said, a lot of change is accelerating. And if there's one quality, I guess, that the new middle manager of the future and the leaders in general need is the ability to cope with change, ride the wave, not get stressed out or lost by it, but the reverse, to actually enjoy the challenge of change, enjoy stepping back and looking at the larger picture and how they and their team fit into that, and being flexible enough to adapt the way people work to meet human needs as well as as you say, in many cases, the very firm need for certain jobs to be done in very fixed ways for
Absolutely.
good reason. It's kind of getting the balance right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, just are you, in one or two words, pessimistic or optimistic about the future for middle management?
I think given our conversation today, I am very optimistic. It's hard when you look at the world that we're living in to remain optimistic, isn't it? Um, but I am optimistic, and I'm optimistic because actually I do want to answer one question that you asked earlier, which might just shine a final light on this. I'm optimistic because when I look at my own children and I see the vocabulary, their level of knowing psychologically, neuroscientifically, um, their attunement to some of the idiosyncrasies of being a human being today in this stressed environment, actually, they probably hold quite a high chance of skillfully leading into the future. When I look at middle managers today, I'm seeing an unavoidable need to catch up with the needs, you know, the sort of the pressures and the forces that take us into that stress and into that highly demanding environment. And I do see the negative. I see that the current reality is not great. When I work with individuals, when I work with teams, I can see how quickly they evolve into forms of themselves that can navigate this environment. So I am optimistic, but it does require work, and it does require space, and it does require awareness. to evolve some of these like these, I was going to say characteristics, but it's more skills and resources that we do have available to ourselves.
That's brilliant. It's been great taking this time and space with you. Thank you very much, and look forward to
Likewise.
continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you, Sam.
Yes. Thank you, Peter.